And Joe, we begin this morning with that new polling that shows President Trump's approval rating continuing to hover in the 30s. A new CNN poll shows only 36% of Americans approve of the job that Trump is doing. The Quinnipiac University poll puts his approval rating at 38%. 3 other polls last week put the president's approval between 36 and 37%. In the CNN poll, Trump's approval rating among independents plunged over the last month, dropping from 47% approval in August to just 31% today. And when it comes to Trump's qualities, 32% say they are proud of him as president. The same percentage, less than 1/3, see him as honest and trustworthy. Back in the Q poll, when asked whether they felt the president was honest, 32% of voters said yes, his lowest grade for honesty since he was elected. So, Joe, they're beginning not to believe him, whoever they are. It's the few Americans left who actually would believe that the lies and untruths that this president tells.
It's important to remember that Donald Trump actually had very low honest and trustworthy numbers during the campaign. Even in 2016, he was down, my gosh, in the low to mid-30s most of the time. He just happened to be running against an opponent who had even lower honest and trustworthy numbers. So these numbers aren't so inconsistent from where he was when he was running for president. But John Heilman, there has been so much coming at the American voter over the course of the past 18 months. The question to ask about this precipitous drop, especially among independents, is what's happened in the last month that hasn't happened in the preceding 17 months? Why has he fallen into the mid-30s in 5 of the last polls that have been released?
I think the question, Joe, is it's a good question, but I just reframe it slightly. I think what's happened here, you know, we've talked about this on the air a lot of times. He's been in the high 30s before, and you and I have discussed it's usually been at the low points when things have gone worst for him, you know, after Helsinki or after the crisis at the border with the kids in the cages. You've had these moments, and we've said, well, the high 30s, mid 30s is his irreducible core. That's when he's at his worst. I think what we're seeing here now as we get closer and closer to election day, to the midterm elections, is the accumulated weight of 17 months of scandals and controversies and outrages and things that for a lot of the voters who make the difference between him being in the mid to low 40s and him being in the mid to high 30s is that the weight of all that, the gravity of it, is finally sort of sunk in over time. And the reason that it's sinking in is because we're getting closer and closer to a decision point. We see this in presidential election years. We see it sometimes in midterm election years, especially ones that are acutely referenda on the incumbent. I feel like that's what's happening here. There have obviously been things in the last few weeks that have been bad for President Trump, but it feels more like as voters turn the corner into Labor Day and start looking at the decision they have to make in the midterms, there's taking stock of the totality of Trump's presidency, and that is weighing him down.
Willie, you of course had the president, I think at his high water mark, at least from his inaugural week, where he was at 43, 44, 45% in the spring. Things seem to be going pretty well for him. Then you had the child separation policy. Then you had Helsinki. And then over the past month, you've had a barrage of legal proceedings that have gone very poorly for him. Michael Cohen coming out, his longtime fixer, talking about all the things that Donald Trump did improperly. And then, you know, it's one thing if the media says it. It's another thing if Democrats say it. But you've had a jury of Paul Manafort's peers and other judges outside the political realm actually saying, delivering some verdicts that are pretty harsh towards Donald Trump's people, towards his former campaign manager, and toward Donald Trump himself.
Yeah, and you can't call these outliers anymore. When you have 5 polls in the space of a week, the president and his White House have said, well, these are the ABC News poll, the Washington Post poll, they were wrong before the election, et cetera, et cetera. When you have 5 polls showing pretty much the same thing in the mid-30s, that is a trend and not an outlier, no matter how much he's going to wave the Rasmussen poll. But if you look at the accumulation of recent events, Elise, the book op-ed, the Woodward book, plus the op-ed, painting a picture of a White House in chaos. It begins to explain some of the drop in those independent numbers, especially. We saw that in the ABC Washington Post poll as well. People who may have given him a try, perhaps walking away now.
Well, this is what I've been talking about a lot, because during the run-up to the election, when we were doing focus groups with the Lord Ashcroft polls group, we were talking to a lot of hold your nose voters. Right. And so these were people who, they really didn't want to vote for Donald Trump, but they definitely weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton. So they just chose to, go ahead, vote for Donald Trump. The accumulation of 17 months of constant antics on top of the instability of international affairs and Donald Trump's pretty cavalier attitude towards things such as war, I think that this has started to sink in a bit. And it's just something that you're not going to go out of your way to defend if you weren't that strongly invested in the first place.
And we have so many people like that, David Ignatius, as Elise was saying, so many people I know, so many of my friends that supported Donald Trump who still will tell you they support Donald Trump, though they're offended by their tweets, they're offended by his behavior. Basically, it still is a binary choice. Well, you know what? He's not Nancy Pelosi. He's not Hillary Clinton. So I guess he's still our guy. It seems that the Woodward book, as well as that op-ed in the New York Times, certainly has a lot of people in that category thinking twice and starting to think, well, listen, maybe he's just not up to the task. Maybe we look forward to a Mike Pence or a Nikki Haley running this party and running this presidency down the road.
I think you're right, Joe. What's striking about these numbers is that they come at a time when the economy is strong and is delivering on Trump's promise to increase the rate of growth, to increase growth in particular in manufacturing jobs. So the numbers that Trump would want are coming in, and I think people feel them. But even so, there is this pulling back. Why? And my explanation of this would be that in a sense, Trump's strategy is succeeding too well. He goes so hard for his base in these rallies, these raucous rallies around the country, fulminating against Democrats, against the media. And it obviously works with the base, but I think that's turning people off, that strategy. And just a final point. In the time that these polls were taken, John McCain was in his last days, or his funeral had taken place, and people watched a celebration of what kind of normal, decent American politics is. And watching that funeral, I thought, there are a lot more people in America who like George W. Bush plus Barack Obama than like Donald Trump. I mean, it's that simple. You add together those two. So maybe that's what we're seeing in these numbers is yeah, Trump's got his base, but increasingly that's all he's got.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.